Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Today we're going to take a look at how to get a full HDMI experience from your original Commodore 64. This means a pixel-perfect 100% digital video signal plus the audio signal all over a single HDMI cable. And we're not using one of these cheapy AV to HDMI converters. This is a pure digital video signal, and the way we're going to do it is with the full-size VIC-ii Kawari. This is a VIC-ii replacement that I've shown on the channel a couple of times now, and it outputs a DVI signal over a micro HDMI connection. The problem with that is that it doesn't include the audio, and a lot of displays these days, especially modern TVs, are going to expect audio to be included in that HDMI signal, and there's no real way of adding a separate audio signal to that HDMI path once it's already at the display. Now keep in mind I have found the compatibility with this DVI signal to be hit and miss, so it's not guaranteed to work with every single display. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video. Some other things we're going to need is a Commodore 64 bread bin case. This probably won't fit properly inside a Commodore 64C, so one of the flatter cases. We really need a little bit of extra space, so the bread bin it is. It also should be noted that the Kawari isn't fully compatible with the shortboard Commodore 64s, so chances are if you're putting in a Kawari, you're going to have a bread bin anyway. We're going to need some HDMI cables, specifically a micro HDMI to full-size HDMI male-to-male cable, preferably something around 30 centimeters in length. We're also going to need a HDMI to HDMI female cable, again around 30 centimeters in length. We're also going to need this HDMI audio embedder. I'll have a link to this down in the description below. A little bit of double-sided mounting tape, preferably a cable tie as well. A micro USB cable. In this case, I've taken an old cable and just cut it to about 15 centimeters in length. And then I've just revealed the two power connections. You could also use a cable that has the data connections in there as well, but we only need the actual power connections. This is what's going to power our HDMI audio embedder. Likewise, we're going to need a 3.5mm audio cable. This is going to connect into the HDMI embedder, and the other end is going to take the audio from the SID and also a ground connection and embed that into the HDMI signal chain. Again, I've just taken an old cable and cut the end off, so it's also about 15 centimeters in length. I've also crimped on a little DuPont connector here. That's just to make it easier for this particular install, but you can just hardwire it to somewhere on the C64. We'll look at that when we get the case open. Something that's also preferable but not strictly required is an RF replacement, either my board here or one of the other aftermarket RF replacements. Getting an RF replacement is super simple thanks to our channel sponsor, PCBWay. Just head over to PCBWay where you'll find my RF replacement, or alternatively you can upload your own Gerber files using the PCB Instant Quote, Quick Order PCB, and then add them straight into your cart. And before you know it, you'll have shiny new PCBs in your hand ready to go in your C64. We thank PCBWay for sponsoring today's video. You can also do this with an original RF modulator, but you will run into issues as to where to route the cabling, so we'll talk about that when we get this case open as well. Finally, we're going to need something to update the firmware on the Kawari and also run the Kawari utilities. So I'm going to be using an SD-to-IEC, nothing special about this one, but you can also use one of the SD-to-IEC with Epic's fast load cartridges or a Pi 1541 or a Kung Fu flash. I'm going to be doing this with the SD-to-IEC. Now, before you go getting all these extra bits, I do recommend just getting the full-size Kawari if you don't have one already, and updating the firmware to the latest version and making sure that's compatible with your display. There's no point in getting all this extra stuff until you know that the Kawari is going to work with your display or TV or whatever. So let's first install the Kawari, get the firmware up to date, and then I'll show you a couple of things that I had to do to get it to work with my capture device, because out of the box, this thing would not sync to it at all. So it is very much hit and miss when it comes to this DVI signal. Hopefully you'll have better luck than I did, but yeah, most of my displays, like the plasma display that's in this room and the cheap LCD display that I've got in the bedroom, would not work with this, but after updating the firmware and changing a couple of things, I've at least had better luck, but not 100% compatibility. Let's get this thing installed. So here is the bread bin that it's going to be installed into. As you can see, it already has my RF replacement board, and I've also removed the S-video connector that normally sits here and put a cable tie in. The reason for this is the HDMI cable needs to run out of the Commodore case somewhere, so that's probably the best spot to do it with. Like I said, if you've got an original RF modulator, you're going to have to find a different place to run the cable out of that's not going to get in the way. And if you've got a different RF replacement in there, chances are you might have that spot already free. All you need to do then is just make sure that you've got some kind of strain relief for the HDMI cable. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's get this Kawari in, update the firmware. So I'll pop the original VIC-ii out and install the Kawari, making sure that we line up the notch on the silk screen here with the notch on the silk screen here. So it's going to go this way for this particular board. And it should press snugly into the VIC-2 socket. Now to perform the firmware update, I'm just going to use the original DIN connector on the Commodore 64, so this will still have the analog video signals. The Kawari still generates luma chroma, so that gets mixed by the RF modulator and put out on the DIN connector. So we'll start by using that, and then once we've got the firmware up to date, we'll move over and test the DVI output. Okay, so once you've got the Kawari installed, just power on the C64, make sure that it's working and outputting a video signal. As you can see, this machine has got Jiffy DOS installed, and the colors may look a little bit off. Don't worry, we'll address that once we get the firmware up to date. So let's go and grab the current firmware and utility disks and see how that's done. To start, we'll head over to the GitHub page for the VIC-2 Kawari and just scroll down until we find a link to the Discord server. This particular firmware isn't publicly released yet, but it is available in the Discord server, and it'll probably end up being the current firmware soon enough. So click on that link, you can hit accept invite, and if you don't have a Discord account, you'll obviously have to create one. After you've done that, head over to Call for Firmware Testers, and you should be able to find a post from the 21st of February with the links to the 1.14 firmware. For our board, we've got the LG version, which is the large Kawari, so we're going to download the main LG DVI zip file, just continue, and we're also going to grab the updated utility disks, which is linked here, so Kawari Utility 1.4. Once they're downloaded, we want to open up the zip file for the firmware, and I'm just going to copy across the D81 disk image, which is basically the 5 D64 disk images in one disk. So it's a little bit easier just to use the D81 if your device supports it, which I think most devices do these days. So I'm going to copy that and the firmware utility disk over to the SD card for the SD to IEC to read. Once we've got those copied over to the SD card, we can then put this back in the SD to IEC or whatever device you're using. Power on the machine and find the D81 disk image. And start the flash program. Have a quick read of what's on the screen and then hit any key to continue. Now, I didn't remove the flash bit lock jumper. So on the Kawari itself, there is a set of jumpers here, and we need to remove the one that's next to the number 1 on the board. This will just allow the Kawari flash to be written to so we can do the firmware update. Normally the jumper's on there just to keep any misbehaving software from accidentally writing something to the Kawari flash. So you need to remove that jumper in order to flash the Kawari. Let's power the machine back on and try that again. Okay, it's identified the flash, wants us to insert disk 1. Because we've got the D81 disk image, all those disks are technically on the same disk, the D81. So it's already inserted, just hit any key to continue. It'll show the version that it's going to update it with. And for using the fast loader, I'm going to select no. If you're using the Epix fast loader with an SD to IEC or Jiffy DOS or something, you want to select no to use the fast loader. I think you only want to use the fast loader if you're using a Pi 1541 and no other fast loader or kernel replacements with that. So in this case, I'm going to select no, and we're going to hit F to perform flash. If you're not using any fast loaders at all, this is going to take probably a good 10 minutes. With the Jiffy DOS, it probably takes about 2 minutes. So it'll start reading little chunks of the file, copy them over to the flash memory, flash it, verify it, and then move on to the next bit. And every so often, it'll ask for the next disk. Now again, because we're using the D81, all those disks are contained in the same image, so you just hit enter every time it asks for the next disk. At the end, it'll say done, press any key, and after that you can perform a verifier if you want to do that. It's going to take the same amount of time as it did to flash the thing, so be prepared to wait again, but I'm pretty sure that the flash went successfully, so I'm not going to bother with that. Power off the machine, power it back on. And now we're going to load up the utilities disk. And I'm going to select the config program. And this will probably happen if you haven't changed any settings on the Kawari yet. So I'm going to initialize this machine as power machine. And you'll notice the colors have changed quite a bit already. Then I'm just going to power off the machine, power it back on. And that looks a lot more familiar to me. So it's now a PAL Kawari. While we're here, we can go to the utilities disk and load up the comp ed or composite settings editor. And you'll notice the values here are probably different to the ones that you may have on your machine. And that's because I've already tuned these. In fact, Randy has included some presets if we select J. And you can see that for the 6569R3, which is a PAL VIC-2, there is a preset that I've already created for this machine. The original color settings from the Kawari seem to be pretty different from what an original VIC-2 would be. So a few weeks back, myself and Adrian from Adrian's Digital Basement, we went through and just fine-tuned these settings just based on the values from an original VIC-2 chip, looking at them on an oscilloscope, and then pretty much replicating that with the Kawari. So for the PAL versions, you'll find a preset that I've made. And for the 6567R8, which is the NTSC version that most people are probably going to use, you'll find Adrian's settings under the preset. So I'd highly recommend selecting them because, yeah, the Kawari original settings weren't that great in my opinion. So now that everything looks good there, let's try this DVI output, see if it actually works. So I'll power the machine off and connect this micro HDMI to the Kawari. And I'm just going to route this other HDMI straight into my capture device for now. We're not going to worry about the audio embedder just yet. We just want to make sure that the DVI signal is actually going to work before we go messing around with the other stuff. And as you can see here, we are getting no video output. Now, this can be resolved for this particular capture device. This is an EVGA XR1 Lite. But I did also borrow a couple of capture devices off Mr. Lurch, and also I tried it with this cheapy HDMI to USB capture device. None of these I could get working. So this is an original Elgato HD60, the older version, and this is a USB 4K, apparently, capture device. None of those things worked, and it's only recently that I managed to get the XR1 Lite to work, but we do need to adjust some settings in the config program, so I'm going to have to swap back to analog video output. If you're lucky, the video output will just work straight out of the box, but yeah, for this thing I had to change a setting to get it to work. So back in the config program, we need to change the RGB 15 kHz to on and hit S for save. That got it working with this particular capture device, and half got it working with my plasma TV that I've got in here, but the image was still shifted all the way to the right. So not fully working, but it's worth trying that. If it's not working with your display, that may get it to actually play nice. So now if I plug this back into the direct output from the Kawari, we have a digital video signal. You'll notice that it's currently stretched out, and that is because the Kawari outputs a 16:9 signal, so you're going to need a setting on your display to either put that back into the correct aspect ratio, or in this case, I can adjust this in OBS. So that is another drawback of the Kawari. You're going to want to make sure that it works with your display, and preferably that you can squeeze it back to the right aspect ratio. Just the way it is, I guess. All right, so now we've got the firmware up to date, the color palette looks a lot better, and it's working with our display or capture device. Now we need to add audio to this because at the moment we've only got a digital video signal. All right, let's prepare our audio embedder. Now this is going to live inside the Commodore 64, but not in the little metal case that it's in. There's a couple of screws that we need to take out in order to pull the board out of this thing. So I'm just going to remove the two Phillips head screws from this side with the switch on it. Also going to make sure that the switch is set to line because that's where our audio signal is going to come in from. So may as well set that switch now so that it works as expected once we get all this installed. Those screws removed, we should just be able to slide this thing out. Cool. Here is our HDMI audio embedder out of the box. So this thing is powered off 5 volts DC just by a micro USB connection, hence why I already prepped the cable. And the other end is going to go inside the Commodore 64 and use the 5 volts DC from in there to power this thing. I did have a look with the bench power supply, and this HDMI audio embedder draws about 180 milliamps while it's running. This C64 should have enough juice in it to supply the 5 volts that we need for this thing. And the other cable, of course, is our audio cable, which is going to plug into this side. So it's going to look something like this. Now we just need to hook it up inside the C64 case. The reason we're using a bread bin case is because there's a lot more height towards the back of the case here. And our audio embedder is probably going to sit on top of this cartridge port or maybe above the RF modulator. But I'm thinking on top of the cartridge port should be fine. It's not going to get in the way of anything else. So our HDMI cable from the Kawari is going to run to the HDMI in on the audio embedder, which is on this side. And then the HDMI out is going to run from this side and out of the case. Something like that. Now, of course, you could use just a long HDMI cable and run it straight to the display, but I'd rather have just a little female short cable here, and then I can hook up whatever HDMI cable I want in the future. So before I go sticking this down, I'm just going to connect this. Now, I've found a couple of points here that have 5 volts and ground on them. So that's what I'm going to get the 5 volts from. And we can just confirm that with the multimeter. So if I touch this point here and say the cartridge shield, there's a direct connection there. And if we go from this point here to one of the lower left pins on the RAM ICs, we've got a connection there. And that is definitely 5 volts. So we've got ground and 5 volts just here. And for the audio side of things, I'm actually going to use this right audio input on my RF board because at the moment this has only got a single SID in it, so there's not a stereo SID or anything. So this post here actually has just the audio signal on it at the moment. If you cut this little jumper below it, it won't have the audio signal there. But seeing as this is only a single SID, and it's already right here and there's a little post for it, I may as well just use that. The other place you can grab the audio from is pin 4 of the RF modulator. Now keep in mind these are backwards, so pin 1 starts over here, pin 8 is up here. So pin 4 is the leftmost pin on the right hand side, so this one here. And the final option would probably be the DIN connector. The audio runs to this post back here. So you could potentially solder a wire to that to grab your audio. And just to confirm that I've got this cable correct, I think this white wire should be ground. So I can just check from there to there. That's showing a connection. So this other wire here should be our 5 volts. And it runs to this little filter cap here. So the topmost side of the board is the ground connection. And the other side of this little cap is where the 5 volts goes to. And we're seeing a connection there. So this cable is 5 volts. This one is ground, but obviously you want to check with your cable to make sure you get them the right way around and don't accidentally fry something. Now, seeing as I've already put some solder on here, I'm just going to add a little bit of flux just to reflow these. So this side is our ground. That's our 5 volts. All right, that is secure. So that takes care of the power supply. I should have probably left a little bit more length on this cable, but we'll make do. Now for the audio, like I said, I've already crimped a little connector on here. So that's our audio signal and that's just the audio ground. So I can simply put that on that post there. And then for the ground wire, I'm just going to use a little post on the RF board just nearby for the ground connection. There isn't a dedicated audio ground anywhere, so any ground point will do. Cool. Everything's solid there. Let's mount this to the top of this shield. So this is double-sided mounting tape. It's maybe, I don't know, a few millimeters thick, but it should be enough to protect the bottom of this board from the top of the cartridge port and also stop this from rattling around inside the case. That's our tape applied. There is a little capacitor sitting in the middle of that, but it is below the actual level of the tape, so it's not going to short to the top of this. Okay, I think I'll mount it so the input is on this side, the output is on this side, so this a ways. And before I hook everything up, let's just make sure the case still closes properly. Cool. That looks good. It's not hitting the audio on better. All we need to do now is just connect everything. So this is going to route over to this side. Try and avoid getting too close to this voltage regulator. Plug the audio in. Switch is still in the right spot. And then output, we might loop that into there. Looks good. That's secure. Right, and that should be our full HDMI Commodore 64 ready to go. Only thing left to do now is close it up and give it a proper test. Alrighty, HDMI into the capture device, HDMI into here. Not going to need this thing. Power on. Hey, it's alive. Now, of course, it wouldn't be a complete test without testing the audio. I think there's only one program for that. We have sound. Crystal clear HDMI digital video and audio over HDMI all in one cable, going straight into this capture device or straight into your display if you prefer, out of an original Commodore 64 with a Kawari, of course. The image looks emulator level perfect, as you'd expect, and it sounds perfectly fine. I can't notice any lag or delays in the audio versus the video, so I'm happy to call this a success. Now, as I mentioned from the start, you do need the large Kawari to do this, and you also need a display that's actually going to work with it. So this is kind of hit and miss, and you're not really going to know until you try it for yourself. Personally, I think with my other Commodore 64 that I've been working on, throwing some upgrades at, I'm probably going to use the RGB out of the Kawari. There is also a spot on the Kawari board, this header right here, which outputs an RGB signal. It also does either horizontal and vertical sync or composite sync. So you can use it for a CRT that accepts RGB over SCART or whatever, or you can use it as a VGA, assuming that the VGA signal is going to be correct for the display. It does 15 kilohertz or 31 kilohertz signals. So I think that's what I'm going to do for my main Commodore 64 that I'm currently in the process of upgrading. I'm going to go with RGB because I use a lot more CRTs than I do flat panel displays. And if I need to do RGB capture, I've got the RetroTink 5X. So although having HDMI out of Commodore 64 is cool, personally, I'm still kicking it old school and using CRTs, so HDMI not really a convenient option for those. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Of course, you can leave me a comment, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd be interested to hear if you're planning on doing a similar upgrade to your C64, or if you think this is just insane level. Let me know in the comments. As always, thanks for watching the Retro channel. A huge thanks to the people that support the channel on Patreon. And if you want to do the same, links to that are down below. You'll get ad-free early access. And speaking of which, the next video that's going to be coming up soon is HDMI out of a VIC-20. So patrons will get early access to that, but stick around and don't forget to hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when that video comes out. But until next time, I will see you next time. Bye.